Surprise, surprise, surprise. I'm back again because after wrapping up the lecture, I thought in part three, I realized that I left out the last PowerPoint slide. And I thought a number of things I could do about that. I could just delete that last slide from the PowerPoint presentation. You might not notice, except I had referred to it in the beginning that I would come back and talk about absolutism kind of as such. Um, just an indication that something is going wrong here. I've never, ever had such problems in terms of recording and posting lectures in so many parts and having all these stops and starts. And my apologies for that. My apologies for after having said goodbye and all that, wrapping it up that now I'm here again. So I hope all of you won't stop with part three. But since part four will be posted, you'll at least look at it to see what's going on. And I thank you for your patience. Now, this won't take all that long, I don't think, because it's just this one slide on how absolute was absolutism. And implicitly, I've already kind of addressed this throughout the lecture of part, not, well, all the parts really, because it gets at the types of authority. And again, the issue and the problem is trying to see that both for the English absolutism and French absolutism, trying to see, okay, why is it different from what had come before? I addressed that a little bit um, at the beginning of the lecture in part one, uh, but why all of a sudden do we think of this new development of absolute monarchy? What is it like, especially when there's no one singular approach to it? And I think that when we look at different types of authority, and there are various types of authority. In absolutism, absolute authority is one type. There is a great late 19th, early 20th century sociologist Max Weber, who wrote a major study in economy and society. And in there, he analyzes various types of authority. Like what he does is construct what he calls ideal types. And he does this. This is his method throughout this whole work. Um, he says there's no actual historical example of this absolute type, but from historical developments and historical evidence, he is going to construct this absolute type, which will help us see the differences in things. So there is an absolute type of, or various absolute types of religion, and there's various absolute types of authority. And he talks about institutional authority. And he talks about charismatic authority. Um, and then he talks about imposed authority, military authority. Charismatic authority is the authority individuals have because of their own personality, their charisma. When they have that it gives an authoritative aspect to it. Why do we listen to on TV what the opinions of what the rich and famous have to say? Who cares what Bill Gates thinks about world politics because he knows nothing about world politics. I mean, he's an intelligent, educated, informed man, but he's not an expert in international relations or in any of the particular territories or regions or countries. He's an expert in computers and in business. But we listen to what he has to say. Taylor Swift, she's amazing as an entertainer. But why do we sit and listen to what she has to say about things? Because of that charisma. Now, I know Bill Gates maybe wasn't a good example for charismatic authority, but there is a charisma of wealth. It's not institutionalized. Institutional authority are let's say the flow charts, institutional flow charts. That is important too, and it was important both for the British monarchy and the French monarchy. But then this absolute authority. I addressed this, I think, at the end of part three, because for purposes of this class and this lecture, I would say absolute authority is when all sovereignty resides with the monarch. And that was new. We see that with Bossuet. We see that with Hobbes's Leviathan. After the social contract is made, after individuals give up their individual sovereignty to the state, all sovereignty relies with the state. Now, in medieval Christendom, with the myth of Christendom, sovereignty lay with God, as it does for Bossuet as well, certainly. Sovereignty lay with God. But the popes could be monarchical, they could be royal in that sense, but they weren't absolutely absolute because they recognized other sovereignties and they recognized imperial sovereignty. The question was, what was imperial sovereignty over, and how did that relate to papal sovereignty? That was the question. That was what was being struggled about. That was the conflict between imperial power or lay power and ordained power. It was two different sovereignties. With the cataclysmic transformations of the Reformation, this idea of a single sovereignty wasn't yet developed. What was happening was this overall concept of a single entity of Christendom, led by, let's say, two sovereignties, the lay and the ordained or clerical, emperor and pope, even though there are all kinds of machinations and conflicts within those. What was the relationship between the King of France and the emperor? Theoretically, it was set. King of France was under the emperor. Practically, no. We have the King of France saying, yeah, I'm emperor in my own realm. So there are various conflicts over sovereignty, even if the concept was this overarching myth of Christendom. The sovereign was God or Christ. But yet the major locuses or loci or places, seats of sovereignty were two, the imperial and the papal or the ecclesiastical in a way. With the Reformation and the breakup of this overarching myth of one entity, we have the emergence of distinct entities that became sovereign because there was no overarching entity anymore that could claim was the locus or the seat of sovereignty, even if that was a split contested sovereignty. And so we really see the emergence of what became state churches, even though there were developments earlier on. But within the empire, after the civil wars, we have then the two different confessions based on the territorial ruler, the princes. And within those individual territories, then there was the sovereignty was in the prince to determine the confession and the instruments of government, the growth of bureaucracy to ensure that sovereignty over the religious life. In France, something similar. Francis I didn't really care all that much about the religious stuff. Yeah, he's the most Catholic Christian. He's the most Christian king under the Pope. He knows that. But it was only after the affair of the placards they says no, heresy is not going to be allowed in France because we are under the Pope. We're Catholic, Roman Catholic country, and religiously speaking, sovereignty is with the Pope. Even though the French Church, the Gallican Church as it was called, had achieved privileges from the Pope in the course of the 15th century to govern its own affairs to an extent. That was a delegated sovereignty. Privileges granted from the Pope to the King of France. And then with the French Wars of Religion, that's the conflict. How does this all work? And so the early modern form of absolutism, both in England and in France, even if in England it is constructed theoretically from the bottom up and the giving up of individual sovereignty to the absolute sovereign. And in France, it is top down from God to the sovereign. the result was the same in that both versions of absolute states, the absolute state, was that all sovereignty is in the monarchy, in the government, in the crown. We say, well, in England, there's monarchy and parliament, and that was the struggle. That was the struggle in England, because going back to the Magna Carta in 1215 in England, for all kinds of reasons and developments, sovereignty was always shared between king and parliament. And that was some of the problems with both with James I and then with Charles I, was that Parliament felt that the king was ignoring their rightful sovereignty. Whereas in France, that was never really the issue. The monarch was the monarch, and the monarch had the sovereignty. And the Estates Generale was to support that sovereignty. So when Louis says, I am the state, that's what he's meaning. All sovereignty is with me. And it's absolute. With English absolutism, we have always the tension between a split sovereignty between the parliament and monarch, even if the monarch would claim absolute sovereignty. But the parliament would say, yeah, but we have to grant it. We have the Magna Carta, remember, that acknowledged the king can only rule with the consent of parliament. Whereas in France, the Estates Generale, which is the parliament or the legislature, was there to serve the king. Now, that's kind of a difference. Now, it's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. Because we can't just say there was no concept of absolutism until the 17th century. And we can even say, okay, what was the influence of papal absolutism or imperial absolutism on the emerging absolutism in England and France? That would be, I think, a fantastic thing to study. Maybe it has. I don't know. I mean, this is not my area of research as such. But it would be a fascinating thing to say. What were there, what was Bossuet reading? We know he was reading Aristotle and all those other things. Was he reading Augustinus of Ancona, for example, or Giles of Rome? I'd be willing to bet he did. But, those are the kinds of connections that we need to see what is really new and different about what is developing in early modern Europe from what had been then in medieval Europe. I have it there too. Divine origins, God's absolute and ordained powers. Um, that goes back to a medieval distinction, especially in the later Middle Ages, but it was there from the 12th century on. But then theologians and philosophers did a lot with it from the 14th century on, but that's a whole other story. But it was a distinction between God's absolute power, God's omnipotence, because absolute power means omnipotent. And theologians and philosophers said there's a distinction to be made between what God can do, could do absolutely based purely on his omnipotence. If I don't, yes, I use the male pronoun because at the time that's what they were using, the male pronoun for God. Okay. If God is God, if God is, and if God is God, this is a long story behind that formulation. This is my formulation. If God is, and if God is God, God is omnipotent, and it's God's power and authority, and there's no gender with God. But anyway, that's another issue. The point was that was a theoretical possibility. What God actually did was what God ordained or willed to do. And we know what God willed to do because here we are. So that distinction between the ordained power and the absolute power of God is part of how it all works out in terms of absolute power. If we're talking about absolutism, what does that mean? Was Louis the 14th omnipotent? Not as such. Maybe within France, or at least he purported to be. Was the English monarch ever omnipotent? No, maybe he felt that he was. And here, he again, because of James and Charles, and then Cromwell, they felt that they were. And that was what led to the resistance and the civil wars and the overturning of the protectorate and then the restoration and then the glorious revolution. Whereas in France, it is the pretense of this absolute omnipotent ruler within France, even if not omnipotent in the greatest sense or the greater sense, that then finally led to the French Revolution. So that brings up again the tensions between precepts and practice, between the theoretical assertions and what actually was taking place. That is a constant dynamic within medieval Christendom, and was a constant dynamic within early modern Europe. And as we'll see in the next lecture, the seeming contradictions of early modernity. How do we understand that? And so often, scholars, especially as history has been taught, we ignore those contradictions because they make things messy. How do we put together Sir Isaac Newton's mathematical mind and rationalism and scientific approach with his really kind of far out, kind of weird religious views? How does that work together? How do we handle sovereignty that is proclaimed and theorized as absolute, and then the practicalities of actually trying to implement that and how that goes about? Even if they got close, was it ever really absolute? And obviously not, because with the French Revolution, that showed that the pretensions to absolute power and authority of the French king had limits. But we'll get there when we get there with that. But this theory is important, and the contradictions of the reality, the messiness of political, social, cultural, intellectual, religious, theological life, both in medieval and in early modern Europe, is very messy. And trying to figure it all out. And how does the practice, the messiness, fit with the clear articulations of the theories? That is a problem. And a problem for the historian. It's a problem to teach it, because it's a problem to teach messiness. It'd be easy to reduce it to simplicity and say, this is what this is, and this is what this is, and this is how this impacted this, and this followed this. But that's not what history is all about. That's not what history is. What also is messy is the concept of myth, as I've been using it, and as I do use it, and the myth of the nation state, and the transformation of European culture and society from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state as I said, the kind of the overarching operative system, the ideological structures that enabled everyone within that culture confines to make sense of the world. That's the myth. The stories, not just the stories we tell of ourselves, yes, but it's more of what is behind those stories. What is it that we assume is just the way things are? Those are messy, because there's something there. It's not just a single nice, neat emergence of a nation state that can be framed within these contours with this very clear definition, and we can see it here, 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 and here, and contrast that with what had been, which was not a nation state, but something, something, something else. It was very, very messy. Now, next lecture, I'll start talking about the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment. Enlightenment, that will be messy too, especially if we look at the historical context, what else was going on in the later 17th and on into the 18th century, on into the early 19th century. History is messy. So absolutism is a theory of handling the messiness of the reality. There we go. Now, I don't need to say goodbye and all that again, because I already said that at the end of part 3. My apologies once again, and I'll be back for week 4. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.